Hello, my name is Paul Sandrock, Actful Director of Education. To support language educators at all levels as they move to teaching and learning remotely, Actful is very pleased to provide this webinar. During this unique situation we all are experiencing, Actful thanks all of you for the tremendous and creative effort you are putting forth to support your learners. Today's webinar is led by Leslie Grahn, formerly the World Languages Coordinator for Howard County Public Schools in Maryland. Leslie has developed numerous resources to support language educators, including a wide variety of authentic resources, examples of effective language teaching, and guidance on supporting all learners. To lead today's webinar, Maximizing Skill Building During Live Instruction, Guiding Students Along the Proficiency Continuum, I'm very pleased to welcome Leslie Grahn.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. Today, we're going to talk about how to maximize building skills in students to help them continue to move along the proficiency continuum, even in this difficult time when we're teaching online, we're teaching in a blended way, the students are working completely by themselves. So how can we still stay on track? And so that's our question for today. Take a look at this slide. If you would like to tweet about today's webinar, you're welcome to use my Twitter handle, which is @Gran4Lang, and obviously you can use @Actful as well. So here are our outcomes for the hour that we're going to spend together. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference in planning between face-to-face instruction and online instruction. You're going to be able to prioritize the list of instructional choices to maximize live instruction time. You're going to be able to strategize about supports and models students need to work independently. You'll be able to plan for intentional skill building during live instruction, and you'll be able to access resources for maximizing live instruction time. So first of all, we want to start out by asking the question, who could have imagined? So who could have imagined back at the beginning of March, when everything seemed quite normal, that around the second full week in March, things suddenly became not so normal? And so we had this whole pivot, people call it, or shift, that happened in our instruction kind of suddenly to us. And what's important for us to know is there was no roadmap. So it's not like we knew this was coming and we had plans for it and contingencies and all of this. It came up on all of us. And so for us to really kind of recognize the idea that if we're anxious and stressed out and really feeling like a brand new teacher again, that has to do with the fact that there was no plan for this. And so first we need to kind of give ourselves a break and understand that, okay, there wasn't a plan for this. But now, as we move forward and finish off this school year, and also possibly go into a new school year where there's some sort of blended instruction continuing, how can we be better prepared to make sure that all of the instructional decisions we're making are still very much aligned to our belief system, and at the same time are able to be handled on both an online format and a face-to-face format. So when we think about the shift that's happened to distance learning, and how has it impacted our language instruction? First is that live instruction has become limited or non-existent. I've spoken with many teachers in districts who have no direct contact with students at all. They're just creating modules for them to do. Or folks that only see their students maybe once a week for a check-in time, or if you're really lucky, for a live instruction period. Students are doing more and more on their own. And so we're assuming a certain skill set for students, that they know how to work on their own and that they feel confident to work on their own during this time. Next, students are expected to be skilled at working on their own. Parent small group work has become minimized unless you work on Zoom and you have something like breakout rooms. Most other platforms aren't allowing for that. And so a lot of that support they get from their peers is non-existent for many of us now. The students have limited access to you. And so that's been a really difficult thing for especially our struggling and reluctant learners who know that they could usually count on you to be in your classroom at the end of the day so they could stop by and ask a question or touch base with you. Traditional lesson plan frameworks were not built for distance or blended learning. So we really need to rethink how we're going to make a new version of a lesson plan that allows for live instruction, face-to-face instruction, and also possibly some distance learning. Many aspects of the supportive learning environment in the face-to-face classroom have been lost. So not only is it the proximity you were able to have with your students, meaning that you were walking around the room and checking in with them and things like that, but think about the other little cues that have been lost. So one example is if you have a struggling or reluctant learner in your classroom, in your live classroom, you have students around them that once you give the students a task and they begin the task, they can kind of look around to see what everyone else is doing and then get on board. They no longer have that. And so for us to think about all those supportive kind of aspects of the classroom that aren't available currently in the distance model, how can we try to build some of that in for students? And most people have shared with me that trying to get the interpersonal mode in has become very challenging. And again, without breakout rooms, that's a very difficult thing to do. So when we think about next school year, we're thinking about what is it going to look like? And I've seen so many models. I've seen models that say students will just go to school once a week or twice a week and then have distance learning the rest of the time. I've seen an A week, B week model where students go to live school, go to face-to-face class 4 days a week this week, and then the following week, not at all. And so they switch off weeks with the other half of their classmates. I've seen multiple examples of school systems saying, hey, we already know we're going to stay completely online. And so many of us at this point aren't even quite sure of what next school year is going to look like. And so I really want us thinking about, regardless of the format or the different models that might be out there, how can I maximize student learning and students feeling confident to do work on their own, because that's what a lot of distance learning is about. And so really thinking about how do I maximize the time that I do have with them. And so here on this slide, you'll see that I'm contrasting when you have students in your classroom with you, and that's on the left, although if we return to our classrooms, they're certainly not going to be sitting that close together. And then on the right, where we're just interacting with students through the computer, through technology. And those are very different interactions. So how do I maximize the time that I do have them, whether it's physically in front of me or online instruction, where they're with me and I'm actually conducting a lesson, and what are they doing during the times that they're supposed to work on their own? So first I want you to think about, what are all the different learning experiences you typically plan for your students? So go back to early March, think about how you designed your lessons back then. And if you were to come up with a list of all the different learning experiences you plan for your students, I would guess that quite a few of these would fall into your list. So I would be giving them some kind of warm-up or lesson hook. I would give them practice in the modes. I would have them interpreting authentic text. I would have them doing real-world tasks. I'd be doing some guided instruction, some comprehensible input. And we probably could go on and on. But when you think about the types of activities, the types of learning experiences you plan for your students, now we have to think about, well, what if some of my teaching is going to be when I'm physically in the room with them again, or teaching live online, and then the things they're doing on their own. And so if I take that wordle that I made there, that word cloud, and then I try to separate out, well, what's going to be live and what's not going to be live? That's the new kind of thinking frame that we need to have now. How can I maximize that time, whether it's once a week, twice a week, 4 days this week, and not at all next week? Whatever the model is going to be, what might my thinking frame be that will help me to decide how to maximize that live instruction? And a big piece of this, and again, I want to go back to that list of things that distance learning has made us realize, and that is that students are doing a whole lot on their own now, that typically we would have done a lot more guidance for, or have them have a partner work with them for, and now they're kind of out there on their own. And so we want to be sure that part of that maximizing of the live instruction is about making students feel confident and skilled at doing the task by themselves. So if you think about this picture, which is a pathway, a road that's going way out into the distance, and our proficiency target is down there at the end of the road. So that's what I'm hoping students are going, where they're going to be by the end of this school year. And many school districts and states have their proficiency expectations for different levels. So you might have an expectation that all students will at least be at novice high or intermediate low. And so along that way, typically in a face-to-face all the time classroom, you walk along that road with your students, and then they walk a little bit by themselves by doing independent work in class or homework, things outside of class. Then you come back and you walk them along the road again, and then they do a little bit by themselves. Now the model is I spend some time with you and I take you so far down the road, and then I stop, and now you continue on that pathway by yourself. And so it is a very different kind of mindset. And that's what I'm asking you to think about today, is how might I shift that mindset to help me understand how do I still get students to that proficiency target, but in this different way of traveling this road to proficiency. So if I were to make a priority list for the things I would do live with students, here are some of those ideas. I would want to, while they're physically in the room with me or live instruction online, I want to make sure there's lots and lots of target language use going on. Why? Because outside of class, it's possible they're not getting any of that. And so we're maximizing that time we have them. I want to do lots of comprehensible input with them in context. That's where they're getting new words. Those new words are giving the context for them to be able to communicate at the expected proficiency level. I want them doing pair and small group work. We know that research shows us that reluctant and struggling learners, when we let them do productive group work, their confidence level rises. I want to make sure I get in the interpersonal mode, because that's the hard one to get in when students are working independently. So I want to make sure I'm including that. And then my final bullet on this slide is about, and all along I'm collecting data to inform what my next instructional decisions are. So this is not only informing the next time I have live instruction with them, but it's also informing me about what students need in order to do some of the learning on their own. And so really think about along the pathway that you've been with your students, how have you prioritized the areas for live instruction? Like, what did you make sure that you're doing with your students? And I'll bet many of those ideas are going to be parallel to the slide that I just showed you. So what I want to talk about next is what's in today's title, and that's what about skill building? And so how am I intentionally building skills in students? And you'll see there, to build their confidence in their language skills. How am I providing supports and models and examples to students so that they feel comfortable working independently? How am I guiding students along the proficiency continuum? And am I doing intentional skill building? So let's take this first big bullet, building student confidence in their language skills, and the sub-bullet, providing supports, models, and examples to students to work independently. So when we talk about scaffolds and supports, we want to make sure, especially at the novice level, that they have lots of models, examples, sentence frames, task-specific target language expressions, all kinds of supports. Now, on the distance learning side, those supports need to be inside a resource folder somewhere, right? Because they're not physically in your classroom. in your classroom, some of these things may be on the wall, right? Like target language expressions, things like that. And so they're going to look different in the different environments. But how am I giving students that little bit of support to give them the confidence to engage and persevere to be successful on tasks? So I want to make sure that I'm providing the right amount of support to students, and that I know that's going to increase their confidence. And then I want to progressively remove that support and provide new challenges. And then another piece of that is always providing meaningful feedback to students so that they can move their learning forward. So on this slide, I have some examples of support you might have in a live classroom, meaning in your face-to-face physical classroom, and then also what that might look like in the distance learning classroom. So the picture on the top left is a word wall. Many of us have these in our classrooms. And so that's an expressions list that students can refer to when they are trying to find a word in order to stay in the target language, either to respond to you or to initiate a conversation with you, whatever. Now think about in the distance learning classroom, how might I have a virtual word wall? And so think about what those tools are. Bottom left, graphic organizers. I'm a huge fan of graphic organizers, and I know the other night, Donna Clemente did a whole ACTFL webinar on that. If you're interested, you can check that out on the website. Graphic organizers give students a thinking frame or buckets to put their ideas in before they have to do something with their ideas. And you can find lots of graphic organizers online that are in the target language. The rainbow colored thing there is what we call a picture description frame. And that's something that has expressions all the way around it that assist students in describing a picture. And then the teacher cuts the center out and lays it over the picture. And that's a scaffold for when they're trying to describe things. Obviously, later they do that without it. Beside that is an example of an expressions list when students are playing cards, a card game in the classroom. And so you can see we want them to be interacting like real people do when they play a game together. Bottom center, an example of circumlocution expressions. And so we want to give students the words to say, it's a thing that, it's a person who, right? So if you do something like a mystery item or a mystery person, again, think about how expressions lists like that could also be helping in the distance learning side, where you might put it inside a resource folder for the students. And then the last example on the far right are just anchor charts, some sort of visuals or guides that help students in some way. And if you don't know about anchor charts, I really encourage you to check those out. They just give students kind of a guide for how to do different things. So this one is about if you're reading and you don't know a word, what steps should you go through? And so these are processes and routines that we give students so that they feel confident, in this case, to read on their own. On the distance learning side, the only time students may be able to interact with you is possibly during office hours. And what's important to understand is that most students, K-12, do not understand what office hours are. That is very a higher ed concept. And so do we give them a list of things like this to say, what can I do during office hours? I've spoken with teachers who say, I sit there during office hours and no one comes. Well, have you told them what to do during the office hours? And so notice how during those times, I can support students in their learning. They can check in with me. And so that's a great way for students to still feel supported even outside of the live instruction. If you're interested, on my website, there's a page for tools for scaffolding and supporting learners. You're going to see lots of links to expressions lists, graphic organizers in the target language, lots of things like that. And then also I have an entire Pinterest board on my Pinterest page on this topic. And you can see there's 453 things on there right now. And so many of these things exist out there. The other thing we want to talk about is modeling. And I can't tell you how many times I did observe and evaluate teachers in my district. And modeling was one of the top things that I gave, comments that I gave to teachers as a follow-up to their observation. And that's that students need lots of examples and lots of models to wrap their minds around exactly what you're trying to get across to them. And so that might be using a graphic organizer to plan a speaking performance. You're actually going through and doing a graphic organizer with them, and they're seeing what the process feels like to do that. It might be going over reading strategies with them. And again, there's anchor charts and things out there, resources out there that are in the target language that teach reading strategies that actually the students already know in English, but understand that they can apply it over to the target language. How to use feedback to improve your performances and products. What do I do with this feedback? They need models for that. How to give and receive peer feedback. Models for that. If it's something you're trying to do in your classroom, they must have models for it. How to use scaffolds and supports that I have. And then another example of modeling is analyze sample student work. Actually show them an example of a student piece or product, and then they're seeing what's there and what they could add to their products. Another example is think alouds. Think alouds is where you are literally doing what it says. You're thinking aloud in the target language. So you see this poem here in French called La Vie, which means life. And the teacher actually goes through this. And in this case, it's for teaching reading skills. And so the teacher is talking in the target language, like she's having a conversation with the students. And she says, okay, let me go through and mark all the words I already know in purple. And so she says, I know this. And then she looks at the students, what else do I know? Oh, that's right, I know this, blah, blah, blah. Now I'm going to look for all the words that look like words I know, right? Now I want to look for words I can guess because of their context. And so what you're doing is actually helping them know what is going on in my mind while I'm doing this process. When this is modeled for students, when they go to interpret a text by themselves, many of them will think back to that experience and say, oh, maybe I'll use that thing Mrs. Grahn did when she was talking about finding all the words she knew, finding all the words that look like words I know. So an example here would be, here is an infographic on the left, and on the right is a graphic organizer that goes with it. So to prepare students, let's say there's a task coming up, an interpretive task, where they're going to have to look at a piece of text and then complete a graphic organizer. We're going to model that with them. So we're all going to look at this particular infographic together, and we're all going to contribute to, well, let's see, what would we put in here? How might I use this, etc. And so we're talking it through with them, we're modeling it for them, so that when they're doing it by themselves, they can revert back to, oh, that's right, I remember when we did this with the teacher. When I'm doing some sort of task with them. So on the left, you see I have the targets and the scenario, and on the right is the graphic organizer provided to them. And so we're actually doing some of these as a practice. This is not an assessment task that's going to count, but it's set up like an assessment task. And so we go through it and we think through, okay, well, what would I put on this side of the circle? And what would I put on the other side of the circle? And so we would talk this through so that when students have to do this by themselves, they feel like they can. Here's an example of using student work. I'm using student work to show an example of what someone's finished writing product might look like. This does not have a student's name on it, so they don't know who it is. And they go through and say, oh, I think that the students, that's a really good paragraph. Well, what proficiency level do you think this is? And they've got their rubric out and they're telling you what they think. Well, what do you think this person could do to make it even better? Oh, maybe they should use more descriptive words. Maybe that, right? And so that's the kind of think aloud and talking we need to do with students so that they feel competent at completing the task at their true ability level. If you're interested in some more supports around the idea of guided instruction, which is modeling and examples and things like that, there is a whole page on my website on guided instruction. So now I'm going to stop for a second and have us think about how might supports and modeling address some of the challenges you have faced with distance learning? So I'm going to pause here.
And Leslie, while you're pausing, let me funnel some of the questions that have been coming in and be the voice of many of the participants on this webinar. So one of the questions has been around partner work and pairs or small groups, how to support that, how to enable that in the even synchronous or asynchronous environments, how to at least simulate that.
And so if you're putting students in pairs, whether it's in the online environment or in your classroom, model, model, model. So when you describe the task, then you actually have two partners, a set of partners come up, and they're going to model the types of conversations they're going to have, or what they're doing with the graphic organizer, whatever the task is. Anytime we put students in groups, whether it's in my face-to-face classroom or online, they need a concrete task, and there's an expectation that coming out of that task is usually some sort of product that they can use in another way. So they may have done an interpersonal exchange where they came up with some ideas, let's say on a graphic organizer in their pair, but now they're going to take those ideas, and this pair is going to meet with another pair and share their ideas, and now they're going to create some sort of speaking product or some sort of writing product. So the idea is we need concrete tasks, and we need to model that for students so that we're sure that they understand exactly what the expectations are in terms of what they should come out with.
Thank you. And another related question, when you're asking us to think about the scaffolding and the supports that students may need, how do you differentiate? There are some students that need many more supports and scaffolds and others who are ready to move on.
Yeah. So I think what's important is that I always tell teachers to start out the school year talking about what good language learners do. And good language learners know how to access their resources. They know, they persevere to understand. They don't need to know every word. Right. So we have these, like, what are the attributes of a language learner? And so for students to kind of own the fact that if you need something to lean on, it's there. If you don't, that's okay too. So I'm not going to be upset at an advanced learner who's checking out an expressions list because maybe they needed something from that list that I put out during that particular experience. So the idea is when I have people thinking about planning learning experiences for students, it's like, okay, what's the context? So what's the real world connection? What's the piece of authentic text they're interacting with? Whatever. What supports are you putting on the table to help them out with that task? And then what process are they using? And so for me, it's the marriage of the three. What are they interacting with? So that's the text or the scenario. Two, what supports are on the table? Is there a graphic organizer? Is there an expressions list? And it's just there in case. They don't have to use it. And then the question then is, what processes am I using? Am I using a process like Jigsaw? Am I using a process like Think, Pair, Share? So marrying the process with the text with the supports and helping students see that it's okay that you eventually don't need those supports, because the reality is the supports aren't going to be there if we do a performance assessment unless it is in your individual education plan that you need to have that.
Thank you so much. You've really been addressing some of the also comments about motivation and keeping students engaged. So thank you. A lot of good advice.
Awesome. Okay, so now let's get into the other half of that, and that's the second big bullet, guiding students along the proficiency continuum and doing intentional skill building. And so the question is, you know, we see advancing through a course, a level, a class, whatever you want to call it, as students accumulating content over time. So we have a unit on family and a unit on school, and okay? So that is fine. But actually, skills are not acquired just through learning new content. There has to be some intentionality behind building skills. And so you'll see on my third bullet there, advancing in proficiency levels requires intentional skill building. And so while I have you live in front of me, I want to be building your skill set so that you're able to perform at the expected proficiency level or beyond. And so if we look closely at the ACTFL can-do, the necessitable ACTFL can-do statements, if we look closely, we're going to see that certain skills pop out. So this is from Novice Interpersonal, and you will see that novices are supposed to be able to react to others' feelings. They're supposed to be able to express an opinion, and they're supposed to be able to ask questions. So beyond the normal language structures that you would teach, whether that be whatever the context is, we also need to pay attention to, are we spending time teaching them the right way to, how do you express an opinion? What are the expressions that we use? How do I respond to someone when they express their opinion and I either agree with them or disagree with them? So really giving them those skills, because if I'm truly asking you to perform, let's say at Novice High, it is expected that you're going to be able to express those opinions about what you've learned. Here's one from Novice Interpretive, and it talks about how students should be able to identify the topic and facts. So here comes the main idea and keywords ability. And so how am I building those skills? This one's from Intermediate Presentational, and it talks about expressing your viewpoint and supporting your viewpoint. Again, if I am teaching students to get to and I'm trying to get them to the intermediate mid-level or proficiency level, am I doing intentional skill building around, well, how do you express a viewpoint in the target language, and what do you do to support that? And so I'm showing you examples of things where people are giving their viewpoint and supporting it. And we're looking at different expressions that will support that. Here's another one from Intermediate. It says that, Presentational. It says students should be able to narrate a story. Are we preparing students to be able to narrate a story when they get to intermediate mid? So really, I challenge you to look very deeply. So get out your magnifying glass and look closely at the can-do statements and look at the skills that pop out. And that's exactly what I did to kind of come up with these, is I looked closely at, they need to be able to tell a story. That's a skill. How do you do that? So when you think about doing this intentional skill building, how exactly will I approach trying to do this intentional skill building? So I might use resources like anchor charts, graphic organizers, expressions lists, and obviously some instructional strategies. Those instructional strategies might be strategies for the modes, so interpersonal strategies, presentational strategies. It might be reading strategies, cooperative learning strategies, discussion strategies, thinking strategies. I could pull from a toolbox of strategies to help students think about building their skill in the language. So let's take the example of expressing opinions. These are in Spanish, and you'll see across the screen here, I have 3 examples of resources that would help build student skills in being able to express an opinion. So on the far left, you'll see that's an expressions list on how to express your opinion. In the center is a graphic organizer on how to express your opinion. And on the right is a kind of anchor chart that's showing examples of when people express their opinion. On this next one, identifying the main idea in a text. These examples are in French, except the right one is in English. On the left, there's an anchor chart about being able to come up with the main idea. In the center is a graphic organizer with the main ideas and the details. And then on the right is an instructional strategy called Most Important Word that helps students pull out the important words, meaning the main idea. Here's some examples of resources for narrating a story. And so you'll see on the left, that is actually called 5-finger retell. So it asks students to think about the 5 different aspects when they retell a story. So that's an anchor chart. In the middle is elements of a story, graphic organizer. And on the right is an example of an instructional strategy called Ball of Yarn, where there's different lengths of yarn and students have to continue telling the story till they hit the first knot, and then they pass it to their friend, and then they keep going until they hit the next knot. And so again, all building that skill to be able to narrate a story. Now, if you're interested, I have these on my website, and I am going to go there really quick to show you the examples that I've gathered for you. So if you go on my website, grandforlang.com, and you click on intentional skill building, you'll see that I have these divided by novice. And so there's two of the ones you saw on the PowerPoint. And then as you scroll down, you'll see I have the skill on the left. And then I'm linking you to anchor charts, graphic organizers, expressions lists, and instructional strategies that could possibly go with it. So I invite you to take a look at these as you're thinking about intentional skill building. I have a section called Preparing for Intermediate. So that's getting novices ready to go to intermediate. Then obviously the next section is intermediate. The next section is called Preparing for Advanced, and then advanced. And so the idea is, how can we do intentional skill building with our students that comes along with them progressing on the proficiency continuum? Great. So I'm going to pause again. And my question for you is, how can skill building contribute to student growth in proficiency? So during live instruction, I'm taking the time to do that skill building, or what I call intentional skill building with students.
While people are pondering that question, Leslie, if I may introduce some other questions that have been surfacing during your presentation. One has to do with the use of target language, especially with the think alouds and other ways to help support students staying in and using and being motivated to use the target language.
Okay, so those are two things. First of all, my advice to teachers is always that you're trying to use the target language all the time, even when you're doing things like think alouds, and making sure that we're making it very comprehensible. And so as I'm doing it with the students, it will become obvious to them, just as when we're doing gestures and drawing pictures or pointing to things or whatever. So we want to try to make it as comprehensible as possible, but not make it a whole thing. Now we're going to switch over to English. The question about getting students to stay in the target language, and I know many people in distance learning over the last couple months have had real challenges because students don't even have to turn on their cameras and they're not participating. And first, making sure that the students understand that as an expectation that you are going to participate in the target language, and that by using the target language, you will increase your proficiency level. The second would be, don't worry, because I will always support you through that. And so they need to know that they're not going to be left hanging, but instead there are resources available to them on the wall, in their notebook, on the table, whatever, that are going to help them be able to do that. And I think that's critical. And then I am very much a believer in honey versus vinegar, and that's that I want to recognize students who are doing the right thing. So groups who are doing it in the target language, groups who are trying, and for students to trust you, and that you're not going to give them something to do that they're not able to do. You are going to challenge them. You're going to give them tasks that move them up to the next level, that cause their brain to work. But I promise you, you're going to feel supported through that. And either supported through your small group that you're working with, either through the supports I've put on your table, the supports that are in the classroom. There needs to be a whole feeling of, I'm not just telling you, you better stay in the target language and figure out how to do that, but instead I'm giving them actual strategies to use to stay in the target language. And finally, you can have students actually self-assess and say, how much am I staying in the target language during class? What's my goal for the next time? So that's putting the onus on the student and getting them to consider, oh, I want to do it more than I did the last time.
And that is already being reflected in people's comments about skill building is the route to build confidence in using the target language, and the can-do statements, setting those lesson goals really help students to self-assess and reflect that they are building those skills. So I think again, it comes back to what you said earlier: model, 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 scaffold, 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 and then let them show what they can do. Thank you.
Exactly. So I want to just give you an example of, imagine that, and when I created this particular scenario, I was thinking of elementary, but this can apply to any level. So imagine that, because we're thinking about backward planning, right? Imagine that at the end of the unit, your goal is that the students are going to use the content they've learned to describe a picture. So that's going to be one of the assessment tools you're doing. So when I unravel that, what kind of scaffold, supports, modeling, skill building do they need to do that? And again, think about our current situation. How are you leveraging the live instruction you have online, or if you're recording it, or in the fall, hopefully sometime face-to-face with students? And then how are we sure they might be able to do that task on their own? And so let's see what some of those ideas might be. So as you're thinking about, what do I want kids to be able to do? All right. What are some things I want to do for them along the pathway? So one is, I want to give them the language they need to describe pictures. And so I'm getting some sort of expressions list, and you'll see on my Pinterest board, I have a whole bunch of those for different languages, ways to describe things that are going on in a picture. Students participate in small group activities focused on describing. So they're describing something to one another. It could be one where they're describing a picture and the other kids are drawing. Whatever it is, the idea is they're getting a low risk practice on how to describe. There is no grade attached to this. It's me practicing, making mistakes. It's all good. The teacher does modeling and think alouds of describing a picture. And remember, pictures can be anything. It might be a piece of art that I'm showing. It might be a photograph that I'm showing today that relates to the content we're doing. And this, I model, oh, what can I say about this? Well, let me think about it. I know I can talk about what the weather's like in the picture. So let me think about what I might write about that. And then the students interject and try to help out. But the idea is we're modeling the thinking process for students to do it. The teacher leads students in describing a picture together by using cues and prompts and questioning. The teacher models using the graphic organizer to capture the ideas. So we say, oh, okay, so let's take this graphic organizer. What can I put in this category? What do you think would, right? And so again, you're modeling, 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 so that when they get a graphic organizer to do on their own, they know how. And then the teacher shares an example of a student product. So the teacher shows a picture of the picture, and then also the student's work, and show, well, this is what it might look like. And it's so critical that if you're talking about level 1 kids, we know that novices can make a list. And so it's possible the writing product you're showing them that a student did was a list. And that's important because students should know the rubrics. They should understand that that's what they're able to do right now, and they're working towards going to the next level using whole sentences, etc. But that's okay right now. And again, that will keep students from going directly to Google Translate and trying to write this completely in English and then transfer it over, when they have seen examples of, oh, is that all you need me to do right now? Yes. Here's another example, and this is more at an intermediate level. Imagine that the students are looking at a theme-based text, and they're creating a presentational argumentative writing product. Now that's obviously on the intermediate high level, up that way. So the teacher's got to model ways to glean meaning from text. So we want to make sure that students are still using those strategies of learning how to guess a word in context, how to write all those different reading strategies they've learned in English. Students work collaboratively to glean information from a text. Students practice using graphic organizers to capture their notes. The teacher does a think aloud for writing an argument. The teacher provides a scaffold to student that includes expressions for making an argument. Students give peer feedback on writing products based on what they understand about the skill of writing an argumentative writing product. So the idea is that when you're thinking about skill building, what I want you to think about is, what is it that I want students to be able to do at the end of this, and at what level, at what depth, at what complexity level, and now how can I back map that to give them those experiences so that they can be successful on that task. So I have a little reflection for you, and then we're going to take a bunch more questions. And so I want you to think about your experience today, your takeaway from what we've talked about today. And I'd love for you to attach it to one of these pictures. And I'm not going to ask you to share unless you really want to. But the idea is that I want you to kind of digest what we talked about today, and please think about what your takeaway is. What could you immediately apply next week, in the fall, whatever. And so the idea is, what matters to me is you can make a direct connection between what we've been talking about and your own practice. And my favorite picture is the one on the right that looks like Mission Impossible. Okay, just reminding you that my website is grandforline.com, and I'll welcome you to kind of check out the things there. There's a whole page on guided instruction that talks all about modeling. There's that whole page on intentional skill building. If you're interested, I've created quite a few resources to support teachers through the shift to remote teaching and learning. If you click that black bar when you get to my website, you will find those resources there. And many of them, again, when I was designing them for you, I thought about what can they do when students are with them, what can students do on their own. And so really trying to think about more and more, we want to build up that confidence level that if they're all on their own trying to do something and to show you their best effort, making sure they have the confidence to do that through all these little steps that we do for them. So at this point, I'm going to pause, and we have a few more minutes to do some questions, if anybody has some additional questions.
Yes, there are some questions coming in, Leslie. And one category, a couple of questions are around larger classes, facilitating working in small groups, facilitating any interaction. I know you're mainly focused on synchronous live sessions with students, but there may be ways to handle that also in asynchronous ways.
Oh, sure. So no matter whether this is in a physical classroom or in a distance or a virtual classroom, again, I want to emphasize the idea that there is a task, a concrete task that the group is going to accomplish. There should be a process that they're using. I love cooperative learning strategies. I know they're so 1980s or 90s or whatever, but they are some of the strongest strategies that still exist on the planet. I lean on them a lot. So bring in a cooperative learning strategy, bring in a discussion strategy. And the idea is that that's already been modeled for them because they understand the process. So you've done it a different time with them where it's been a model. And then what are you adding to the table to scaffold and support their work in their groups? And so that's what's important, is that think about what is everything I can do to try to ensure that these groups are going to benefit from this experience the way I'm hoping they will. And so thinking about supports, is it a graphic organizer, is it an expression list, what's the process, and then what's the concrete task. Some other ways that I've encouraged teachers to do this in larger classes is to have each group to have a group leader, and the group leader comes and gets all the materials, they return the materials. The group leader alternates each time you do a group activity. I have seen teachers where the group leader reports back who were the best participators in the group. So again, the students want to be on that list. And so really thinking about ways to, and I'm such a big believer in transparency. And what I mean by that is, when I was in school, I thought someone told teachers what to say. I had no idea that they customized it in any way for me. And so I think it's really important for students to know, I designed today's activity because I know we need some more practice in this, or we haven't done a really good interpersonal exchange lately. We need to get that in, whatever it is, for them to understand there's intention behind what you're doing, and that you used their work, you used your observational data to know what they need next. So it's customized and you're being responsive to their needs. And so you're saying, okay, I need you to do this task. But when I have, people always don't want to spend a lot of time giving directions because they want to make sure the students have time to do the task. But if it's not modeled well and understood and has all the underpinnings like the process and the supports and things like that, there is a high likelihood it may not work the way you want it to. And so I always tell people, take the time to lay the foundation if you want students to benefit the most from it.
Thank you. That reminds me of a group of actually adults that I worked with this week, and we had to do the very same thing, Leslie, for setting up breakout rooms. Was before they went in the breakout room, the task was very clear. There was a Padlet for accountability. So when they got to their group, they knew they had to fill in their column. There was a named facilitator just to make sure that everyone participated, and a named timekeeper. And it worked because of all of those
That's even for adults.
Even for adults. One
Exactly.
of the questions also is, thinking of adults, for students who are at higher proficiency levels or even older in age and probably more used to independent learning, such as in post-secondary institutions, any adaptations, anything that you might say this is the additional strategy, support, suggestion?
Well, I would keep upping the ante on things like scaffolds and supports. So I would make sure that I'm giving them more and more sophisticated language. In our district, in Howard County, we created these things called communicative skill builders. And there were expressions lists for every language and level. So obviously the AP kids had a very different expressions list than the level 1 kids did. And so really upping the ante to give them more and more complicated language to use so that we're still pushing them towards those higher levels. I think it's also still really important, even with adults, as Paul shared, is to make sure the process is clear, make sure the product is clear, what they're supposed to come out with in the end. And I think it just can be, with more advanced learners and adults, you can just do things at such greater depth than you can with students who have less language. But I would totally challenge you to up the ante on, yes, they can still use scaffolds and supports, and they're still going to need some intentional skill building. Check out my intentional skill building page. I have examples for advanced there, and making sure that we're giving them, creating a hypothesis and supporting it and giving evidence and things like that. We can keep up in that ante. And let me tell you, people that teach advanced placement are going to thank us for this, because the students need this slow skill building all along the continuum so that when they get to that advanced level, they can navigate at an advanced proficiency level in terms of skills.
Thank you. And if I may bring one other challenge to you, Leslie, that is being asked, it is, how do you structure all of this? Does all of this happen within one quote class period? If I'm allowed 45 minutes, does the modeling, scaffolding, partnering, examples, think aloud? And how might I balance synchronous and asynchronous to accomplish all of that?
Yep. So funny, you should ask that. I'm actually currently working on some models to share with teachers around the different contingencies I've seen out there, like the 4 days on, 4 days off, the 1 day of live and 4 days not, and all of that. And the answer is no, not in 1 day. And so really thinking through, what does that progression look like? So remember those slides at the end I showed you, like, here's what you want kids to do at the end. How would I back map that? That's not all done in one live session. And so you want to kind of parse it out so that it's digestible, that it's slowly building on skill over time. And so really, because all learners are different, the amount of time you have with them is different, what I encourage people to do is really think about what's doable in the time that you have, and whatever you modeled or scaffolded today in the live instruction, make sure the tasks that they're working on, that modeling helped them feel that confidence to complete the task at the level that they should be able to do it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. You've covered a lot of territory this evening, so I'll let you give us your final thoughts. Thank you.
Sure. So I really appreciate you being here this evening. And again, I want to reiterate that this is very new territory for us. There was no roadmap. And so many of us are just trying very hard to kind of come up with thinking frames and planning frameworks and things like that that will help us. And we're still kind of in this very kind of nebulous place where we don't necessarily know what the fall is going to look like. And even if some districts have said what this fall is going to look like, we're not assured that that's what it's going to look like in the end. And so really being flexible, and what I care about is thinking about, what is my goal? So what's the goal? How am I getting students to that goal? Feeling supported along the way, feeling like they got the instruction and the skill building that they needed to get there. So it can't just be about input. It needs to be about input paired with skill building that's actually going to move me along the continuum. And then finally, the other thing I'd like to leave you with is I'm a huge believer in professional generosity. And so if you're doing great things, please share it with others as well, because that's what makes us stronger as a profession, is that we are in this awesome group of people who all take care of each other and support each other. I want to thank ACTFL for doing all of these webinars to support teachers out there. And you know, all the ones that were done before this are archived, and so you can go back and listen to ones that you missed. So I just want to thank everyone for spending this last close to an hour with me. And I'm going to hand it back over to Paul.
Well, Leslie, thank you so much for this very informative webinar. You've given us so many useful ideas. We are ready to be modeling, scaffolding, supporting, so that all learners can develop the skills they need to grow to their higher level of proficiency that they desire. We as educators are very grateful for all of your guidance, Leslie. Thank you so much. And to all of you language educators, thank you for what you are doing for your learners today and every day. Your learners do appreciate your care, your concern for their well-being, as well as for their development of proficiency in a second language. Please continue to visit www.actfl.org. Thank you for learning with ACTFL.